Ukraine has its own tradition of geopolitical thinking, a tradition that reaches deep into the past and continues to shape the country's strategic imagination today. What are its key traits? Why was it developed more by writers than by statesmen? And how does it relate to Ukraine's current reflection on its identity? You are listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media platform about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Danylo Lubkivsky, a Ukrainian diplomat and thinker, deputy foreign minister in 2014, and currently director of the Kyiv Security Forum. Danylo is working on a book about Ukraine's intellectual tradition and geopolitical thought, which will soon be published in Ukrainian. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support this podcast on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to continue our work. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to Ukraine's frontline regions, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. All relevant links can be found in the episode description. So let's begin. Danylo Lubkivsky, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you very much, dear Volodya, for this kind invitation.
Thank you very much for agreeing to talk. So you are the person who combines in a very interesting way two different things. The first is the experience of diplomacy. You have served for a very long time in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and also as a deputy foreign minister, but also the intellectual experience. You are the person who is writing a lot about the Ukrainian intellectual culture and in particular about the diplomatic and geopolitical thought. And Ukraine is a country which struggled and is struggling, of course, for our independence, for our statehood. But for a very long time, we didn't have a state. And people might have thought, okay, but what geopolitical thinking you have, people who didn't have a state. Whereas in Ukraine, and I'm very fascinated by this, we have a very long and interesting geopolitical intellectual tradition. So I suggest that we talk about this a little bit. So what is Ukrainian geopolitical intellectual tradition?
First of all, I would like to thank you very much. I highly appreciate your kind words. Also, I would like to underline your permanent interest to this very extremely interesting and important topic. But before we discuss the essence of the intellectual tradition within the Ukrainian culture of this special mode of geopolitical thinking, I would like to suggest to start with definitions. By geopolitics, we mean the concept that first articulated by intellectuals at the turn of the 20th century, namely Friedrich Ratzel of Germany and Halford Mackinder of the United Kingdom. Friedrich Ratzel introduced the notion of the state as a living organism, living body, dependent on geography and expansion. Halford Mackinder, in his famous 1904 article, The Geographical Pivot of History, defined the Eurasian heartland as the key to world power. Thus, geopolitics emerged as the study of how geography shapes political power, strategy, and destiny. So this is the essence of the geopolitics. Geopolitics, in its substance, provoke different controversial reactions. Some scholars and intellectuals called it the intellectual poison. Nevertheless, it's clear that geopolitics reflects some mysterious and very interesting dependence between geography and the behavior of nations. Halford Mackinder, in his paper that I mentioned, argued that the core of world power lies in the wide land masses in Eurasia, which he called the heartland, stretching from Eastern Europe through Central Asia to Siberia. Control of this area, he said, gives dominance over the world island, which includes Europe, Asia, and Africa. And here comes his famous maxim that usually is being used in the geopolitical conversations. Who rules Eastern Europe rules the heartland. Who rules the heartland rules the world island. Who rules the world island rules the world.
Well, I found it always strange how a British intellectual would rather say that the core to world's power is in Eurasia, because we understand that Mackinder's legacy in very much inspiring current Russian geopolitical thought, and people like the first Eurasianists 100 years ago with Prince Trubetskoy and some others, and the neo-Eurasianists like Mr. Dugin. So they are thinking that they are controlling Eurasia, therefore they will control the world. While these maritime powers of Europe, they show that no, it's not necessary to control the big amount of land. You can just be, for example, successful on the sea. But is the very concept of geopolitics, it's not something that satisfies you? Why?
We must admit that the concept of geopolitics may somehow provoke different adventurists to use some kind of mysterious or irrational theories to fight for power and to explore the ways of expansionist politics. On one hand. On another hand, certainly the very concept of, as already we mentioned, the very concept that geography influences history, that as some people claim that Napoleon once said, that geography means foreign policy. And here we may find a rational explanation to this type of thinking. When we look at the concept of Mackinder, who says that a lot in global history depends on Eastern Europe, I believe that even today, during the dark times of Ukraine, we may find an answer to this issue, and we may find a reflection of this kind of approach.
But we have in our tradition other people who would introduce the concept of geoculture, and you write about these people, and particularly Yermolenko, who was very interesting, very controversial, but very interesting Ukrainian intellectual, rather right-wing, but he was writing mostly in 1930s, and for Ukrainian, well, it was clear for Ukrainians that the left-wing Ukrainian project collapsed. It collapsed with the Ukrainian independence, and then it collapsed with the Bolshevik destruction of Ukraine. But what does Yermolenko mean by geoculture? It's very interesting.
In my opinion, he suggested a concept which is even more comprehensive than Mackinder's view of geopolitics. Mackinder's and others who followed Mackinder's, like Nicholas Spikeman and others. Yermolenko suggests that geography defines the destiny of nation and defines the way how its culture develops, creating thus the cultural gravitation belonging of a nation to some vast, wider area of cultures. It means that, in his view, what we can interpret this way today, it means that he considers geoculture as something which roots the nation to a particular land, which defines the historical destiny of that nation. And no invader can simply change the cultural mode, cultural belonging of a particular country.
That's very interesting, and I do think that many things are actually go beyond just politics, because they are inside the cultural topics. And well, many people describe Ukraine as a kind of a land and culture between East and West. People like Yermolenko would describe Ukraine as something existing primarily between North and South. And the way how he saw Ukraine as a combination of this, as the meeting point between the Nordic Viking warrior culture with the Southern Byzantine Christian culture. It's actually very interesting. It suggests this idea of a warrior Christianity, if I might say. what are others major topics or invariants, or as you call them, topi, or from the Greek word topos, meaning that invariants or maybe leitmotifs of the Ukrainian geopolitical thinking?
And here comes the Ukrainian phenomenon, something very peculiar, something very special. Over the centuries, we lacked statesmen with proper administrative apparatus. And the trauma of statelessness distorted our self-perception. Yet, the very geopolitical mode of thinking, usually carried out by Ukrainian writers and philosophers, never actually was interrupted. So this statelessness never meant the loss of a living geopolitical mode of thinking. And this mode of thinking entails not only self-identification, meaning my own against someone's other, but also the understanding of the external world, and, which is more important, the desire to influence it. And by doing so, I suggest a concept which I call the Ukrainian external idea, what you have already mentioned, which, in my opinion, includes, maybe the list is not exhaustive, but includes 5 major topos that reflects basic elements of this type of thinking about Ukraine. What's Ukraine? And here I give you one interesting example that maybe would be interesting for our foreign audience. In the text of national prophecy in Ukraine's literature, we find many examples of this type of geopolitical thinking, geopolitical vision. Solomia Polichko, famous Ukrainian intellectual and literary critic, once quoted Mikhailo Hrushevsky, Ukraine's president, first president, as we call him, and famous, well-known historian. He said, "Seldom has literature played such an important role in the life of people as in Ukraine." And here there comes that example. Franko, Ivan Franko, one of the greatest Ukrainian poets, intellectual, philosophers, scholars, created in his Moses, in his famous poem, creates a spatial projection of the Ukrainian state, of future Ukrainian state, the home of his people. That was his gift, wedding gift to his nation. And for the first time in the 20th century, this idea resounded with such power. And let me quote his words. "But the time will come, and with the fiery face you will shine, Ukraine, among the circle of free nations. You'll shake the Caucasus, gird yourself with the baskets, Carpathian mountains, and roll the echo of freedom across the Black Sea, and look like a prudent master upon your own house and your own field." This is the type of thinking that I bring the attention of my readers to.
It's very interesting because you quote Moses, Moisei of Ivan Franko, and for me, it's one of the most fundamental texts of the Ukrainian intellectual history. Because if you think about this, it's very modern because it poses a question: what are the difficult relations between a leader and his nation? And these relations are not unilateral. These relations are not linear, because the people, the nation, can basically, reject the leader, and the leader can reject the nation, and the leader who is thinking of himself or herself as a sacrificing for the nation, but then there is a huge reflection upon, or maybe it's about my egoism, maybe it's about my self-esteem, and then there is this beautiful parable of the plants, different plants who are thinking about who will be the leader, and it's not the high trees who become the leaders, but a plant called teran, I don't know how we translate it into English, who is basically lying on the land and let others shine. So it's a very interesting thing, a very dramatic poem.
You actually quote a part from my book where I bring the attention to this particularly interesting legend that Ivan Franko uses in his Moses.
That's good that I quote the part from your book because, as we joke with Danylo for our listeners, I also suggest that he quotes parts of my book without without understanding it. But that's very good, and I really appreciate the fact that you look at Moses by Franco as a very powerful intellectual creation, and that part that you quoted is actually written in this. In the Dante style, in the style of the Divine Comedy,
the verses of that, of course, of that kind.
It's also very interesting. So let's come back to these your 5 ideas, 5 topi. What are they?
In parallel with what you said about Franco's vision of the relationship between a leader and a nation, Franco also dwells upon other very important topics and ideas within his great poem. He also talks about the sense of identity and about a space of being. And these are fundamental features of the geopolitical thinking. Who I am, who we are, and where do we live? In our literally religious, political tradition, this mode of thinking retains continuity and permanence. In my opinion, the Ukrainian external idea, the idea of Ukraine's mission in the world, or what we can bring into the global affairs, includes several important elements. And above all stands the idea of glory and freedom. Glory in this context is a multidimensional concept. In the religious sense, it means the glorification of God, certainly. In the chivalric, in the military sense, valor on the battlefield, and in the broader meaning, the independence, power, and greatness of a people and its state among other nations. The idea of glory in Ukraine's tradition starts from the intellectual environments of very important circles based here in Kyiv. First of all, the Sophian circle of Yaroslav the Wise, the fathers of Kyivo-Pechersk monastery, and the monks of the Vydubachi monastery, situated not far from the place where we record our conversation. And the idea of glory resounds in the outstanding monument of that epoch, and particularly the Sermon on Law and Grace by Hilarion, the first metropolitan of Kyiv, of Rus descent. And he actually raised the matter of glory as something which stands above everything. I quote, he said, "Behold the city, how it shines in splendor," meaning by this that Kyiv is a capital of glory. And he addresses the Almighty, telling him that, "Continue thy mercy upon thy people. Turn famine into abundance. Strike fear of our princes into neighboring realms. Grant wisdom to our lords. Multiply our cities. Nourish thy church, preserve thine own treasure." And this millennium-old prayer, in some wondrous way, retains its relevance to this very date.
It's very interesting that you mentioned glory, because for many people around the world in the modern age, glory seems to be a very outdated concept. And I remember I was very kind of puzzled when I was reading Raymond Aron's famous work about War and Peace, and when he was saying about glory as one of the key categories of the war. And of course, in Ukraine, the word glory is very, very important, because our slogan, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, and Slava Heroyam, Heroyam Slava, glory to heroes, this kind of entails, it's very deep in our minds. And I think glory is something that balances what we might call critical thinking, because the idea that you express something to criticize is one thing, but the idea is that something, some event or some act is so big that you cannot avoid talking about this, is what is glory. Because glory in Ukrainian is connected with the word Slava. meaning the word, Slava and Slovo. And if you look back, for example, how glory is in Greek, I think it's kluon or something like that. It comes from the ability to hear. Glory is something that is so loud and so big that you cannot avoid talking about this. And I think it's very good that you invoke this.
I thank you, Volodymyr. Glory in this sense means eternity. It means memory. It means the recognition and the reason why you should be remembered forever. And in this sense, glory goes hand in hand with freedom. And in Ukraine, it produced one of the greatest intellectual formulas that we have in our culture, actually embodied in the Ukrainian national anthem. Ukraine's glory and freedom have not yet perished, meaning that these two big ideas are of utmost importance for Ukraine, for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for our listeners, it's not pathetic what we are talking about, because glory entails some very, very tragic element, because usually we talk about glory of somebody who died, who was killed, who lost his or her life on the battlefield. And in order to save the memory of these people, we use this concept of glory. And therefore we're talking about the glory to heroes. And this concept also, it goes from the, let's say, 17th and 18th century, when, let's say, the great Ukrainian political project of Cossacks was destroyed by the empire. And therefore people were talking about the glory of these Cossacks and singing the songs about them just to keep them alive in memory, in a way.
But this idea also underlines Ukrainian understanding of a special role of its homeland in the global affairs, in the international affairs. By so, the Ukrainian intellectuals in 16th, 17th century, they develop an idea of a special Ukrainian, Ruthenians, Kyivans role in the international relations in this part of Europe. And thus was founded the idea of the Kievan Zion, or Kyiv as the second Jerusalem. Look, and the idea of this approach, immediately provoked a future conflict with Moscow. Moscow began its anti-Ukrainian policy in this sense, saying that Muscovy pretends to be the third Rome, final and eternal capital of the Christian empire. And this is the basic conflict, geopolitical, geocultural conflict between Moscow and Kyiv. Moscow tried to be an old Rome, something what Ukrainian scholars of the 17th century described as enormous evil. But Kyiv is a symbol of resurrection. Kyiv is a symbol of life, not imperialism. And here comes one of the most important elements in the philosophy of Ukrainian geopolitical thought. And now we come to this second topos of the Ukrainian external idea, the idea of the Kievan or Rus Zion. I wouldn't dwell upon all elements of that idea, but I will underline the most important part. Since the time of the early campaigns against Constantinople, Kyiv had been, in my opinion, a center of resistance to any external hegemony, any external dominance. And this gene not only survived in later generations, but became one of the key traits of our national character. It manifested itself in the dynamic foreign policy of the Galician-Volhynian state, later in relations within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and afterward with Moscow. In the 20th century, the gene of Ukrainian anti-imperialism became the foundation of the liberation movement, and then Ukraine's revival in 1991, And now, in the 21st century, it stands as a pillar of the struggle against Russian neo-imperialism.
Yes, I think this anti-imperial and anti-tyrannical element is one of the key elements of the Ukrainian, both internal and external idea. And the Zion, the metaphor of Zion that you mentioned is very interesting when we compare it with the Moses, with the story of the Moses that we already mentioned. But another interesting thing is about the Rome, because I'm still very fascinated with the fact that Russians have come up with this idea of the Third Rome. They did not invent it, by the way, but there are several things that basically worry me, and it's a long story to elaborate on them. But contrary to the Russian myth, that is based not only upon the idea of the Third Rome, but on the idea that the first two Romes have fallen, that there are no Rome and no second Rome, meaning Constantinople. The Ukrainian story is a story that, no, these Romes are alive and we are okay with them, and we try to, communicate with them, because we took our Christianity from Constantinople, from the, let's say, second Rome, but there is a big part of the Ukrainian identity which is connected to the first Rome. I mean, the Roman Catholics, but also the Greek Catholics. And the very idea of Uniate Church and Greek Catholic Church is the idea that you can basically combine Constantinople with Rome. You can avoid this inventing of the third Rome, but rather combine the first two, combine the Eastern and Western Christianity. And this is a very interesting idea, how to this apocalyptic vision of history that was developed by Moscow from the very early age. The Ukrainian tradition is rather to say, okay, let's combine different elements together. Let's save them. Let's not deny them. Let's put them together.
In my opinion, Ukrainian intellectuals throughout our history suggested they didn't participate particularly in the dispute between those Romes, as you mentioned them, but they suggested a special or absolutely another way of thinking. Kyiv claims to be the second Jerusalem because of this spiritual, humanistic, in some sense, self-understanding. And this is a very important and peculiar element, since if we look at the heritage of the Ukrainian intellectuals, we will immediately find that they are based on the very democratic and humanistic roots. I don't want to present some kind of idealistic picture of Ukraine's intellectual tradition. It consists different, various important elements. But nevertheless, this type of thinking, of being let's call it democracy, or being a human-centered ideology, that was kind of featuring signature feature of the Ukrainian intellectual tradition, with all other elements that should also be mentioned. But here I would like to present an example which, in my opinion, illuminates how important this tradition is. One of the brightest thinkers whose name aptly illuminates the meaning of and depth of this intellectual tradition is Stanislav Orychovsky, of the Oksha coat of arms. He was born in 1513 and he died in 1566. He is a prominent Ukrainian intellectual. He was here to a distinguished Ukrainian-Polish noble family. He was student and graduate of the universities of Krakow, Vienna, Wittenberg, Padua, Bologna, and he was even a disciple of Martin Luther. He is famous for his admonition to the Polish king Sigismund Augustus of 1543. What is peculiar about Orychovsky? He was younger contemporary of Machiavelli. Both of them wrote their famous text in order to teach the rulers they addressed how to live and how to guide the politics in this difficult world. And Orychovsky, in my opinion, is simply anti-Machiavellian philosopher, Contrary to Machiavelli's pragmatism, realism, one then produced the theory of realism in the international politics. Orychowski teaches the ruler to become a philosopher, one who lives not under a roof, but under the open sky, and thus feels himself a mighty oak. And what else he says? He calls upon the sovereign to grasp the deepest essence of power and to remember that not every man is fit to rule. Imagine, he teaches the ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, not every man is fit to rule. Only he who by nature strives for truth and justice. And then, equally revolutionary, are Orychowski's reflections on law and kingship. I mean, I met these words with admiration. In 16th century, he says, he asks the king, which is greater in the state, the law or the king? And without hesitation, he places law above all, reminding that, I quote, it will be most just if you remain within the bounds of your duty. For, and here is literally, this is the quote of what Orychowski said, the king is chosen for the sake of the state, not the state for the sake of the king. This is the type of thinking which then was continued in the Cossack tradition, then was continued in the constitution of Pilip Orlik, in the constitutions of the Ukrainian People Republic, Western Ukrainian People Republic, and came to our days.
Yeah, and we're still very far away from putting this into practice because in our current political tradition, not every ruler follows this work, but follows these words. But it's very good that Orychowski tried to, you know, if Machiavelli in his Il Principe tried to decouple politics and ethics, politics from ethics and politics from religion.
Mm-hmm.
Orychowski tries to recouple them, to bring them back. And that's very important and very, very useful. Let's move on, and we need to discuss three more elements or three more topics of Ukrainian external idea.
Two more. Actually, Orychowski represented the corpus of democratic and humanistic ideas. That was actually the third topos of the Ukrainian external idea, as I understand it. The fourth one is interlinked, deeply dependent on three previous topo. The fourth idea, the fourth element, the fourth topos is the dream of a union of the free and equal. This is part of the geopolitical mentality of the Ukrainian intellectuals that we witness that we know in our history. And a canonical example of such thinking is offered by a unique phenomenon, the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, Ukrainian secret organization, which was founded in 1845 by the prominent Ukrainian intellectuals that came out with the idea of the equal relation between the Slavic nations, including Ukraine, obviously. The Brotherhood was founded on the idea of equality among nations, including cultural, linguistic, and political equality. Let me quote, "And Ukraine shall arise from her grave, and she shall once again speak to all her brothers, the Slavs, and they shall hear her cry, and the Slavic lands shall arise, and there shall be no more Tsar, no more prince, no count, no duke, no lord, no noble, no serf, neither in Muscovy, nor in Poland, nor in Ukraine, nor in Bohemia, nor among the Croats, nor the Serbs, nor the Bulgars." And here
Is it Kostomarov?
Actually, I think this is Kostomarov together with Bilozarsky. And here is yet another important element that I should mention. One of the members of the Brotherhood was a young student, 19 years old youngster. His name was Georgy Andruski, who drafted a sketch of a constitution for a Slavic federation. It's almost, apocryphal in status, this document, but nevertheless, it existed. According to accounts, this Slavic republic was to consist of 7 autonomous entities: Ukraine, Poland, Bessarabia, the Baltic region, Ossia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and the Don region, without Russia. They simply didn't count Russia as part of this type of federation. The fate of Andruski ended tragically. He was punished, he was arrested, he was exiled, he returned back to Ukraine, but he was limited in his rights and he tragically died. But his ideas never died. And their ideas never died. And here comes the phrase that I love very much, and I would like to mention it as well in our conversation, that the ideas of the brotherhood then continued throughout decades and ended up in the famous words of Alexander Shulgin, former Ukraine's foreign minister, famous intellectual, a man who was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs himself. And he, in 1930, in his letter to the League of Nations, he said, "When Ukraine becomes free, it must join the European Union, provided it exists." It's fantastic. He envisioned the idea of the European Union in 1930.
It's very important, and the very idea of Cyril and Methodius brotherhood is very, very interesting. For our listeners, Taras Shevchenko also comes from this group, and basically he suffered probably from the biggest punishment in 1847. But if you think about this, most probably, so this idea connects Ukrainians with Slovaks and Czechs, because Cyril and Methodius were the Greeks who invented the Cyrillic alphabet, but initially for Moravia. And in Moravia, you still have kind of a cult of Cyril and Methodius, which is kind of a paradox because in Czech Republic, people write in Latin characters, not in Cyrillic characters. But the connection between these Slovak and Czech Slavophiles and Ukrainian Slavophiles, and in particular Shevchenko, is very, very strong. And Shevchenko writes his famous poem Heretic about Jan Hus, which he considered, by the way, it was lost. The manuscript was lost, and Shevchenko died without understanding that it will be refined and found again. So the interesting thing is that the Slavophile movement at that time was very democratic. It was linked to the third topos of yours, and then it was hijacked by the Russians and used as a kind of a ideology of Russian Slavophile or pan-Slavist empire, which of course had wars against Austria, against Turkey, with this idea that we are liberating the Slavic nations. But it's very interesting how this idea initially was very democratic Republican, and as you say, the kind of idea of international federation, which is of course not only Ukrainian, not only Slovak and Czech, not only some others, because at the same time we have this wonderful movement, which was Giovine Italia in Italy by Mazzini, and then Young Europe and everything. So these are the movements, the ideas that were very important in the 19th century, that was basically anti-tyrannical, anti-monarchical, anti-imperial, and many different nations joined it. And just for our listeners to say that Ukrainians were part of it. Ukrainians were not somewhere else. They were part of it, and they were developing this idea too.
Agree. But here we may find what, in my opinion, is the most important feature. The difference between the Slavophilia understanding by Kyiv and Moscow. And here comes this difference between the Third Rome and the Second Jerusalem. And it is clear and vivid and bright example, since Moscow suggests the idea of the Slavic nations joined under Moscow and united in one river, as Pushkin put it.
In one sea.
In one sea, of course.
Slavic rivers
going into Russian Sea, meaning that all of them will finally lose their identity.
Absolutely.
And Kyiv suggests the idea of equals, free and equals. Those who wouldn't suffer from imperialism neither from Berlin nor Vienna nor Moscow.
Absolutely. And for example, for the Slovak and Czech intellectuals, they were not only thinking about Russian imperialism, but also about German imperialism, right? And, it's still present today. Look at the way how Ukrainians are talking with Belarusians right now. We usually talk in our languages. And I admire these conversations when Ukrainians talk in Ukrainian, Belarusians, mostly unfortunately in exile right now, because current Belarus is a part of this Russian aggression. But when we meet Belarusians in exile, we talk our languages. We can talk like that with the Poles. If Poles understand a little bit Ukrainian and Ukrainians understand a little bit of Polish, we can talk like that. We can also, if you move further, we can do the same thing, but with more effort with Slovak and Czech. But we will very, very rarely meet a Russian guy who would say, okay, let's talk your languages. He would say, yeah, you learn Russian and we will speak Russian. Yeah.
The Ukrainian idea here brings yet another fantastic feature. And here comes the fifth element of the Ukrainian external idea, as I understand it and as I put it. This is the idea of what we call sobornost. It means spiritual or organic unity, and the idea of union between different parts. At the foundation of this notion lies the idea of indivisibility of the Ukrainian people and their lands. This is the core of the geocultural thinking, the concept which was articulated by Yevhen Malenyuk. No conqueror will stay on the Ukrainian land forever. Ukrainian lands will get back together. And this is the notion which is part of this sobornost thinking. Our intellectual tradition shows that the idea of gathering lands and the sobornost of the people evolves into the cause of internal unity, but also it goes to broader horizons. And this is not the unity not only of Ukrainians, but of Western and Eastern Slavdom, what we already mentioned. This is about the unity between Western and Eastern Europe, not only the union of Ukrainian churches, but even the overcoming of Great Schism of 1054 in the spirit of the Florentine Union of 1439. And this goes toward to a pan-European reconciliation. So Ukraine, this is not a frontier, some kind of borderland that is doomed to die on the front of the European realm. Ukraine, what Santa Graciotti, famous Italian Slavist said, it's a pan-European synthesis, and this is the final and concluding element of the Ukrainian external idea.
I would go even further. I would say that not only the European currents, the European trends meet here, because we can talk about three Abrahamic religions or three monotheistic religions, right? And it's very interesting sometimes on the topography of Kyiv, how you basically see, for example, we at Pan Ukraine, we are located on a place where 100 meters from us, 200 meters probably, there is one of the biggest mosques. And then to the upper on the hill, down the hill, you see a Protestant church. Then if you go down, you will see like the places that were a Jewish town. Then across the road, there was a Polish town. And, so, and of course, we are talking about very important elements, right? So you have in some will say, okay, Kyiv is an Orthodox town, but here in this very, very little space, you have Muslims, you have Jewish, you have Rome Catholics, former city of Rome Catholics, you have Greek Catholics, etc.
And actually, all these cultures, all these religions contribute to the Ukrainian external idea. within the Ukrainian national and cultural identity. And this is very important. So summing this up, I was saying that the Ukrainian external idea, the idea of Ukraine's mission in the world, a concept which I introduce as the understanding of the intellectual heritage tradition of previous centuries and of our current contemporary thinking, this external idea includes 5 important elements: the idea of glory and freedom, the idea of Kyiv Zion, or Second Jerusalem, as a synonym to a special role which Kyiv plays in the European and world history. The corpus of democratic and humanistic conventions symbolized by Stanislaw Rychowski. The idea of union, actually to be within the union of free and equal nations, which was, in our tradition, first articulated by the Cyril and Methodius brotherhood. And then comes the idea of soborность and unity as the synthesis between different, as pan-European synthesis. This is what Ukraine dreams about and actually fights for it today.
And it's very important that all these ideas are in the past. Of course, they expressed by many great Ukrainian intellectuals, but they are a task for the future. And this is something that Ukrainians want to achieve. Danylo Lubkivsky, thank you very, very much for this conversation.
Thank you, Volodya. It was a great pleasure and an honor for me to participate in your famous podcast, and I wish you all the best.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media platform about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Danylo Lubkivsky, a Ukrainian diplomat and thinker, deputy foreign minister in 2014, and currently director of the Kyiv Security Forum. Let me remind you that you can support this podcast on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to continue our work. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to Ukraine's frontline regions, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.